Welcome to the 26th Return to Freud. In this Return to Freud, we're covering a paper from 1915 titled Repression. This is in some sense, or in many ways, a paper that's directly connected to the paper we covered in the last Return to Freud on instincts and their vicissitudes, where Freud goes through how psychoanalysis conceptualizes instinct, and goes through some early mechanisms by which the subject or the mind wrestles with instinct and in some sense struggles with instinct and its development, but actually makes a note in that paper that he is going to save repression for another paper, and this is that paper. So I'm going to share my screen now, and let's cover it. Tools. Go. All right, Repression, 1915. And this image here, I think I selected it because of how Freud talks about repression as the way we deal with censoring our own instincts, the way we deal with inhibiting our own instincts, and the way in which that manifests itself in our speech, that we will often hide or speak around sort of the core of our repression. And that's also why in an analytic session, there is so much emphasis put on speech, signification, and its role to how we come to terms with our deepest drives, let's say, and specifically our drive fixations. So when it comes to instinctual vicissitudes, one of the ways in which we deal with them is repression. And Freud here talks about repression as a resistance to make the instinct, quote unquote, inoperative. The reason why ultimately the mind has to do this is because flight is impossible. Namely, if there is some danger or some disturbance outside of us, we can often avoid it or withdraw from it or escape from it. Like you'll often hear behaviorists talking about the fight or flight response. But Freud's saying when it comes to instinct, no such flight is possible, claiming the ego cannot escape itself. I've often reflected on this, for example, when people are feeling depressed or feeling down, and they often will refer to like going on a trip or going on a vacation or going on a holiday, and just reflecting on the fact that, you know, you're still going to be with yourself, you know, so you can't escape yourself with a trip or a holiday or a vacation. The ego basically uses judgment or condemnation of a certain instinct. And Freud locates repression as the in-between space of the impossibility of flight and the full-blown maturation of a judgment or a condemnation against. He claims that this is observable in the transference neuroses, however, that repression is not present at the beginning of our development. He says repression emerges specifically from a sharp cleavage between conscious and unconscious symptoms. You can here think about it as the basic urges of the body, the basic motion of the body, and that as we develop cognitively, as we develop our mental faculties, we by necessity have to restrict, inhibit certain behavioral functions, certain tendencies and motions of our body, because of social life, because of practical restrictions, because of a whole bunch of things about existing in a world. But that the essence of repression is keeping the content at a distance from the conscious, namely that something that's very deeply repressed, the subject won't even be aware what is deeply repressed. Of course, that's why analysis is necessary. There are other contents which are probably more accurately described as somewhere in the pre-conscious, namely that a subject might be aware vaguely of what is repressed, or at least the distorted mental representations of what is repressed, but will take great efforts to avoid speaking it, or again, speak around it, or speak negatively of it, that type of thing. So as we covered in the previous paper, there are more primitive defense mechanisms, specifically oppositional reversal and turning around on the subject. This was discussed in behaviors like voyeurism and exhibitionism, sadism and masochism. So these are very deeply rooted inclinations in behavioral systems, whereas repression requires, in some sense, more cognitive faculties, which makes sense. There requires to be a stronger ego. And of course, that's why in both the Freudian and the Lacanian traditions, the idea of building a strong ego is kind of frowned upon and basically seen as reifying or making repression stronger. But that, and then basically becoming more repressed, because Freud's saying here that what is repressed and what is unconscious are correlated. And that there are two basic phases, the first one being a primal repression, basically related to the foundational, let's say, bodily motions, bodily preferences, tendencies, and a secondary repression, which we'll get into later. He says the primal repression is an instinct representation denied to consciousness. So if you remember from our previous workshop, we never have an understanding of the in itself of instinct, according to Freud. We always have an instinct representation. We always understand our instinct mediated through representation of some kind. And an instinct representation is fixated on, established at a very young age. And then this is what undergoes a form of primal repression, let's say. The second stage of repression is quote unquote repression proper, where Freud says there are mental derivatives of the repressed representation and after pressure. So you have the original instinctual representations of the primal repression, and you have then mental derivatives, which are not directly connected to the original primal repression, but are kind of loosely connected in chains and associations that are made later in life, that are seen to somehow reflect that primal repression. That's why he calls it an after pressure. Freud's pretty clear to emphasize that we have to think about repression as both a repulsion of repressed content and an attraction of what is primally repressed. Often when we think about repression, we're thinking about the repulsive dimension, the keeping content down, but we also have to focus on what is primarily repressed in its attractive dimension, because the unconscious is never stopping. The unconscious is constantly moving. And the attraction to what is primarily repressed is never eliminated by the function of repression. So repression does not hinder instinctual representation from continuing its existence. It continues to exist in a subterranean or a, underneath the surface, you might say. So instinctual representations, he says, quote unquote, proliferate in the dark. They take on extreme forms of expression. Again, because what's primally represented is not going anywhere, it's not being eliminated, you can't get rid of it, there's no flight from it. It's like chaining it up or locking it up in a basement, depriving it of air, depriving it of food, depriving it of resources, and it just becomes more extreme. It becomes more intense, although it still exists in the dark. I have the image here of a guy at night watching pornography. This is the type of thing I think that's worth thinking about. When I'm alone when I'm basically with my deepest libidinal self, what are the images? What is being represented? What is my primal attraction? What's going on there? And of course, they can be mental derivatives, basically the after pressure of repression, but it will still give you a type of clue. Then instinctual representations perceived by neurotics, Freud says, basically what is the most instinctual representation? Freud says are perceived by neurotics as extraordinarily dangerous, strong, and alien. So again, I think that gives a really nice, clear description of where the primal repression is located within oneself. At least I find that to be extremely informative, extremely helpful in reflecting upon myself. The deceptive strength of instinct, he says, results from an uninhibited development in fantasy and a damming up of satisfaction. So like I was trying to say with the metaphor of, it's almost like you take your most desired primal urge and you lock it up and you inhibit it and you starve it and you basically deny it. It's a great denial inside oneself. And so it's, the reaction to that is another counter force. He says repressed representatives can gain a free access to consciousness. Censors can be lifted. In fact, he claims that in analysis, that is a necessary process, that it requires the patient to produce derivatives of the repressed, which are either remote or distorted and can pass censorship. Like I said, some secondary forms of repression will be easier to access than the more primal forms, certainly easier to speak, reflect upon, without it fundamentally destroying your identity. But of course, the more primal forms of repression will be more disturbing, will be more confronting to basic drives, to your basic fixations. He says neurotic symptoms are derivatives of repressed winning access to consciousness, which was previously denied. So again, neurotic symptoms, when we're thinking about hysteria, when we're thinking about obsessional neurosis, these are symptoms of repressed contents making their way to consciousness in a very distorted way. And potentially, of course, in situations where subjects go to analysis, they have made their way to consciousness in such a way that they make life unlivable, that they make existence impossible. So subjects will then often go to analysis. Of course, you can go to analysis even if that's not the case, just if you want to go to analysis to learn more about your unconscious. But that is one of the reasons why analysis becomes necessary, let's say. Repression acts in a highly individual manner. In other words, it's idiosyncratic. There's thus no general rule for revealing a distorted or remote content. It's not a one size fits all. That's why I think that Freud institutes and puts at such a primary emphasis on free association. However, it's very interesting that he says, and this is connected to previous discussions and previous explanations of the primal repression, that the objects that men give most preference, in other words, their ideals, often proceed from the same perceptions that they most abhor, that they hate the most. So this contradiction, this conflict between love and hate, is really at the core of repression and really at the core of say, primal repression, and getting in touch with oneself, working with your deepest loves, working with your deepest hates. This is definitely the path to self-knowing in this model, and that one can trace the origin of the fetish by instinctual representation as a split in two, one part repressed and a remainder idealized. So there's a way in which the core becomes inaccessible to consciousness, whereas the fetish, what you're conscious of, is the idealized remainder of this process. So he says technical devices can lift repressed instinctual representations to consciousness temporarily. He only gives the example of jokes. You can see why comedy and comedians in particular can be subjected to extreme ridicule. You can see the why, for example, comedians are perhaps taking so much risk by making jokes, because they're really playing with the core of people's basic attachments. They're playing with the core of people's basic primal identity, and so can make people uncomfortable, and can make people perhaps too aware of their own self. And Freud is quick to emphasize that this is very temporary, that someone can become made aware of a repressed content and then quickly recensor it. It's only made conscious by the fact that it's funny, and that's pleasurable. Whereas the core point of repression is that it's trying to keep down something which is unpleasurable. Now, this is the real, the case Freud makes in some sense against repression, basically arguing why repression is not a useful strategy employed by the mind. It's not a very intelligent strategy. The main thing is that it demands a constant expenditure of force. You have to exert a lot of energy. It's in some sense an unnecessary expenditure of energy. And that you have to exert, because basically the attractive force of the primal repression is a constant, continuous pressure. And that the repressed content can become expressed in sleep. And that's, of course, when the censorship is lifted, when you're sleeping. When you're sleeping, your consciousness is no longer capable of keeping the content down. And thus the repressed content can form again in dreams. I might actually share something now from a dream this past week that I had, which was quite difficult to observe. Which was that I basically observed a woman, a motherly figure, stabbing quite brutally a child to death. And I don't know. I mean, I could analyze that in myself perhaps, but it's extremely violent. It's extremely vicious, that image. And this is the type of energy, these are the types of forces that are at play in one's dreams. Difficult to confront, to be sure. Repressed instinctual impulses in itself may change the representation when censor or prejudice is removed. So in other words, if someone has done the self-work to lift or remove repression, the very way in which the instinctual impulse was represented, the secondary derivatives, you might say, will change. So I think that's a very interesting dimension. And whenever I'm reflecting on this, especially when I was reflecting on this paper, I couldn't help but think that the concept of repression and what Freud's talking about here have enormous political consequences, because how much of our political life is based on these structures and our psyches operating in this way. I think quite probably, obviously, there's a a huge connection here, which is why it's so interesting, I think, when people try to think at the intersection of Freud and Marx. There's a lot of useful, or Lacan and Marx, it's a lot of useful work to be done at that intersection. He says that the unrepressed fate of the idea will be decided by the degree of activity, the concentration, the cathexis. The content would cause conflict with the conscious. In other words, basically, you can bring the repressed idea to consciousness. Inevitably, that will cause some inner and outer conflict. conscious conflict, because your entire identity might change, or at least there could be some meaningful changes in your social relationships. I've actually seen some of that happen in the last years of some work I've done just in men's circles, where people change quite dramatically when they're given the space to really express their primal consciousness and primal unconscious. Sometimes people can change very dramatically. Could be changes of gender, could be changes of political orientation, could be changes in the way you sexually express yourself. The quantitative factor is decisive for the conflict, he says. Basically, a certain degree, the unconscious energy, the unconscious primal force, has a certain degree of strength, and at a certain degree of strength, the conflict becomes real. It becomes externalized in your everyday life, in your world. So this is not pointing towards a harmonious balance. This is not pointing towards connecting with your unconscious and then everything's great and everything's fine and everything's fixed. On the contrary, everything will be potentially a mess, but a more true mess, perhaps. So you can divide up the single entity, the instinct representative, into two: the idea and the instinctual energy, which is, Freud says, a quota of affect. And he says the motive, the purpose of the repression, as I've stated previously, is nothing but the avoidance of unpleasure. The affect is more important than the idea. So basically, whatever the idea is representing is sort of, I guess Freud is saying, kind of epiphenomenal, and that what's more fundamental is really the emotion, the core of the bodily drive, and that symptoms will form in psychoneuroses in the return of the repressed. This is a very famous notion in Freudian psychoanalysis, metapsychology. The return of the repressed, that repression is never really an effective mechanism to get rid of the core of the repression, and that they'll return in substitute formations in the form of ideas. I think this is the final note on this paper, where Freud basically goes over three different forms of the psychoneuroses, concentrating on the ones we've classically covered since the start of this journey: anxiety hysteria, conversion hysteria, and obsessional neuroses. And he goes into the relations between repression and the idea substitution formation. Very quickly here, because I recommend going into this paper yourself to study it in greater detail. But you have the repression substitution in anxiety hysteria, where the idea and the repressive content do not coincide. Freud says that in anxiety hysteria, what is repressed is the fear of the father. And the idea here is displaced onto the fear or phobia of certain animals. We might think about snakes. We might think about other animals that people are classically afraid of. And maybe even that's an interesting way to interpret some religious mythology as an anxiety hysteria. Conversion hysteria. He said there are many mechanisms for substitutes, many different ideas, and the ideational content is completely withdrawn. This analysis is the least clear to me when he talks about conversion hysteria. The obsessional neurosis is more clear. He talks about withdrawing of libido energy, and that they become expressed in hostile or sadistic idea substitutes, basically where hate is expressed as opposed to love, as the affectionate trend. I've experienced this immensely. So if anything, I mostly associate with the obsessional neurosis, and in my personal life, I've most strongly experienced firsthand the obsessional neurosis. I wanted to make one quick after note, and this is inspired by the paper that Mika suggested we read for this lecture, for this workshop. I haven't written the exact name of the paper, but it's on the Freudian Unconscious Facebook group. Here are just some points that I thought were quite worth reflecting on for our conversation. If we get to it, I'm sure we will. The first point is that the end of analysis brings the subject to the real of the drive. And that requires the subject to accept within the symbolic the original bodily fixations. That identifying the primal trauma of birth is metaphorically like removing the overturned lamp, setting a house on fire. The building is still burning. So in other words, it doesn't do any good necessarily to simply point out that we are all traumatized by the fact that we were born, but rather deals with here the problematics of being a burning house, metaphorically, and what do you do with that fire? The paper suggests that analysis is function is to secure the best psychological conditions for subjective function. Here he references Lacan's barred subject and the object patia, and basically brings us to the ethics of the symptom. I think this is extremely important. We need to think the ethics of the symptom. I think that's a very clear and simple program for those who are interested in the philosophy of psychoanalysis. And finally, they say, or the paper emphasizes that the function of the father is to free the subject from the desire of the mother. But the father and the problem of the father, and this is basically the authorization crisis that Ishik, our friend Ishik references. And also I think it has a lot to do with what many different intellectual circles call the meaning crisis and so forth. The problem is that the father is arbitrary, and that the ultimate solution is not identification with the father, but rather signification in lack. And that involves a transformation of the symptom into a symptom, where basically in accepting your original bodily fixations, you are capable of enjoying what previously you found disturbing. I think that's incredibly helpful. And that's the paper. So Repression, 1915. Thank you all for listening. And I just open it up. Any of you guys want to contribute and jump in, please feel free.
So repression, that's quite interesting. What is repression? What is repressed? Yeah, so it's a good reading, but it's difficult to get really clear grasp of what Freud is doing, since he's so experimental here and always trying to further his understanding of how to better understand the situation in analysis, and also in the way that in the previous paper he was taking neurosis as a kind of a launch pad, one could say, of investigating the primary ways that the mind and the drive work. So I'd like to highlight that he does like the neurosis here as a primary phenomenon, which he sort of like jumps from. When thinking about repression, I was thinking that maybe it's easy for us to think of some type of like heavy force, some kind of pressure. I mean, when I'm talking right now, I feel there's some type of like almost like a pressuring force that's pushes me towards a certain direction or something, some kind of like vague mass, something like exerting a weight against the door that threatens to open up and so on. And also I think that in like contemporary, like normal psychology, there is a tendency to think that we should understand our human situation from the viewpoint of repression of feelings, of emotions, and so on. I think that Freud's view is quite different here. What does really repression consist in? It's not this vague force. It's not some kind of vague mass of thing. It's something quite distinct for Freud. And he's really trying to work towards a kind of a distinct account of what is repressed really, but he doesn't say it too clearly in this paper. So when repression takes place, we can take Freud's words at its face value that it's always the case that then a substitution has taken place. Repression is kind of an evidence of some type of substitution having taken place. And when we think of repression, we then should think that what's really repressed is not instinct, it's not affect, it's not drive. Freud doesn't say that the drive is repressed directly here, or the instinct, if you like to resort to that language. And he also says here that repression is inseparable from the phenomenon of the return of the repressed also, which Lacan highlights very much, especially in his first seminar. So when repression takes place, I think that we can think of it as evidence of some kind of substitution having taken place, a substitution which might take the form of like a symptom. Say when someone develops like a nervous cough, like some kind of like bodily tic developing when there is some kind of difficult situation in life and something is left unsaid, and this symptom then takes the place of the speech that the subject would like to say, but it gets repressed, this speech. So Freud elsewhere also has said that symptom can in this way take the place of speech in a conversation. So it is as if the symptom is speaking in a place where there are words missing from the edifice. So I don't think that the notion of repression here is some kind of overwhelming force or pressure that we cannot handle. What is repressed, it will inevitably just return and form a substitute. That's the kind of account that I read from Freud here.
Eric, did you want to continue on from that, or
yeah, I do want to kind of
take a
continue
different
on with that, because I think what is repressed is precisely the signifier, or what he calls the representative of the drive. I think that's Triebsrepräsentate. So it's not Vorstellung, but it's a similar concept. It's a representative that I think Lacan effectively interprets to be the substance of language, signifier. And he understands this signifying chain that is constructed on the basis of metaphor and metonymy, or as the Freudian terms are, condensation and displacement, respectively. And I think when I first read this paper several months ago, what I missed, and coming back to it, I was really kind of taken by, is the role of primal repression here. This first repression, what Paul Verhaeghe in the paper that Mika gave us, what he likens to the kernel of the drive, this nonsense, that all other repressions are connected to that primal repression. through the signifying chain, through these vicissitudes of condensation and displacement that are themselves nonsensical. And so you have this very interesting overlay of sense and nonsense. The signifier without any particular referent signified. It's in other words, what is repressed is not what is encountered or perceived as being unacceptable to one's consciousness, but only what is tangentially connected to what was primarily repressed. Because we encounter things all the time that our conscious ego might think is unpleasurable or harmful, but we don't repress it. But the things that we actually repress are things that we wouldn't necessarily think to be harmful or adverse. They only get repressed because they have this connection to the primal repression. And then on top of that, you have this opposite effect, which I find also so fascinating, which is this splitting that then actually becomes something very pleasurable. And I think what here we can understand something of Lacan's notion of das Ding, the thing, which he takes from Freud's project. And there's this dual reality to das Ding, that the thing, which is the mother, this cathextion of the mother, is what is primarily repressed. But then certain signifiers can then be elevated to the dignity of das Ding and become overly pleasurable. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of bring those coordinates to what Mika was talking about. And to me, those are the things upon kind of the second encounter with this paper were struck me the most.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I'd like to spend some time reflecting on both of your reflections, but I first want to see Dimitri. Do you want to jump in here or?
Yeah, I've just a very simple question of what is primal repression, and at what point does it take place? Does it take place at the time of the birth, that trauma? Because then it doesn't have some kind of linguistic thing to it, whereas repression seems to be linked to the signifier. So I wonder how does that work in regards to the idea and the energy, the instinctual energy.
Mika, did you want to answer that or?
Yeah, I would like to connect it to discuss the topic of primal repression a bit further here.
Sure, yeah. So basically, Dimitri's question is, what is primal repression? What time does it take place?
Yeah, there is a curious notion that Freud uses when he introduces the notion of primal repression here. He uses the term Vorstellungsrepräsentanz here for what is denied access to consciousness. So reading Freud's words here. So we have reason to assume the existence of primal repression, an initial phase of repression that consists in the psychic ideational representative, the Vorstellungsrepräsentanz of the drive being denied access to the conscious. This establishes a fixation. From then on, that particular drive representative continues to exist unchanged, and the drive remains attached to it. So if we are reading Freud with Lacan, when Lacan goes over the notion of Vorstellungs Repräsentanz here. Freud is talking about the separation of thought from affect, from emotional relation. Well, Vorstellung would be like an idea, a presentation, or an image of some kind. And when Freud is here using Repräsentanz here, it's not just a representation or just representative of a representation, but one could say that it's whatever takes the place of representation here, that which takes the place of representation. So when Freud is talking about this, Lacan assumes that what he's really talking about is just the signifier. What Freud is describing with Vorstellungsrepräsentanz here is just signifier. The signifier is what is at the split of affect with an idea. And the notion of ideational representative, it can be taken as some kind of signifying element, which sort of like fills out a vacant position in the discourse of the subject. It's something that comes into place of lack, representing a lack in the discourse. The missing representation is subject's discourse, and thus its status is unconscious. It's present in the speech thus, but in a disguised form. It's transposed into language of neurosis, into ciphered language or clandestine language, as Lacan says. But it's really a substitute that fills out the kind of a void of missing representation. Since Vorstellungsrepräsentanz, it doesn't bring into mind any kind of a representation, but it's just representing a lack of representation. So it's a kind of a hole in the discourse that needs to be filled out with symptomatic action.
Eric, do you want to take over from there?
Yeah, just trying to answer Dimitri's question. I think the place of the primal repression for Lacan would have to be at the place of the master signifier, the instantiation of the master signifier, which we can also understand as being the phallic function, the name of the father, the first appearance of the sexual non-relation, and I think it's kind of all wrapped up within the notion of separation, the child from the mother. And so there's something, what's involved at that primal repression is something deeply sexual in all of its valences. It's that point at which the sexual nature of the child begins to become apparent through the signifier. And so that's, however you want to understand that, whether that's through some kind of Oedipal narrative or whatever, or something more abstract. I think that's where it would have to be located from a Lacanian perspective.
William, did you have another question or something to add to that?
Yeah, I did. First of all, thank you so much. It was very clear and interesting talk. And I've always tried to kind of grasp what Freud is saying. And I think repression is such an important topic. And as my understanding, he really was the one who first introduced repression. And now it's just so, in our thinking and the way we understand things and how we imagine our mind and everything. There's so many things. I took like 3 pages of notes, but I'll try to focus on one. I guess for me, and I think in a cultural context, I think question still seems to be there. Certainly it was with the neo-Freudians and with Marcuse and the 60s and all that stuff. Is repression necessary? Is repression something that we have to do? We have to master our instincts. We have to find a way to self-mastery involves repression. And this also relates to another topic, which I think is kind of kind of relates to it is the question of sublimation, meaning that sublimation. And I think the psychoanalysis is still on the fence around it. Is sublimation a part of repression or not? So that's really the big question, because we often see repression in the negative, like, oh, I'm repressed, and oh, this is something. And even though we talk about language, like now our language has to do with repression and signifiers and whatever. I mean, it's a bit too intellectual. And I think that the real question is like the necessity of repression, and also what happens. Like how do we? I think that's the basic thing, because I think it's been given a bad rap, culturally speaking.
Yeah, I agree with you. Many points there I agree with, and I can only sort of relate to how I've sort of battled with this very issue in my own way. Is that, well, I've come across direct quotes from Freud so far in the readings where he frames sublimation as a way of dealing with this energy without repression. So he separates the two, at least in some of the papers I've come across, and seems to suggest that a form of sublimation is possible without repression. In my own work, for example, I can sort of say, right now, I mean, I'm not an expert, and I haven't like well-developed program about it, but I am working on this idea of the art of being a man, which is basically based on sublimation and the idea of holding space for this energy instead of sort of immediately repressing it. And then the other point I wanted to make about repression being seen as a negative, in this specific paper, Freud says we also have to see repression in its affirmative dimension. Namely, we have to see repression as there's this affirmative bodily drive, which is also a part of repression. So it's a negative sort of censorship, and it's a affirmative pushing forward. So I think we have to think both simultaneously.
Can I ask a couple of questions to William here?
Yep.
So when you're thinking of repression, what do you think gets repressed? I gave one view, but it seems that you have another. And a follow-up question would be, how would you fill in the notion of intellectual in how you used it here? What do you mean by intellectual?
I'm sorry, I have trouble understanding what your question.
What gets repressed in repression, if you think it's questionable whether it's necessary?
I don't really know. I mean, I don't even, I don't like to kind of get into other people's, belief systems about things. So I can't really give you an adequate answer. I think just reading Freud's text, I think there's some really interesting things there. I really like to keep the question open, that if repression is even there in the first place.
All right.
So I mean, I don't want to say, oh yeah, repression is there. It is there in our empirical experience, for sure. On a more fundamental metapsychological level, who knows? And I'm not here to talk about that. I think repression is important in everyday experiences. Of course, we repress all the time, practically every minute, in my opinion. Yeah. I think it's an important psychological function. So I would agree with Freud there. I would think he was right. Maybe because I mean the question of language and repression and signifiers and all that stuff. I just on an intellectual level, on an academic level, should we say? I think there is something interesting when he talks about primal repression and secondary repression, or primary repression and secondary repression, and how that relates, I guess, as it's been bantered about in academia, around like the distinction between psychosis and neurosis. Like, why is it that people suddenly put psychosis in a category of, well, he failed or she failed primary repression, whatever they imagine that to be? But
Right,
anyway,
right,
whatever.
yeah.
Those are intellectual questions, but I'm not, who knows what the answer to them are.
Okay, so what I'm getting at from how you're approaching this question is that it might be that we can imagine repression being some kind of force that is exerted by some agency within the psyche, but that it's not entirely necessary in the meta-psychological sense, possibly that we might keep an open possibility.
I'm sorry, someone's in the room. If I'm,
Right.
can just repeat what you said? Just
The way that I'm getting your approach here is that there might be an open possibility of a meta-psychology without a repression being like a fundamental building block or something like that. But the notion of repression in the way that you expressed it, I think that this approach of understanding repression as some kind of instinctual force or some kind of active pressure or something like that. I mean, that's not, I think, what notion of Verdrängung, repression Freud keeps here. And I think that in psychoanalysis, it's never a repression of some kind of vague, indeterminate thing. It's always repression of truth. It's repression of truth in some way. But the repressed truth always persists. That's the fundamental wager of Freud's whole career. I mean, the truth remains, but in a transposed way, it gets translated into some kind of neurosis where perhaps the whole body can be involved in a hysterical fit in the extreme case where some type of repressed speech, really, signifying elements gets stuck or something. So if it is the case that repression is something that we have to hunt deep down within us and overcome, it's a different understanding than what Freud has. Since for Freud, repression is always ever on the surface level. It's just we have to see the way that substitution is at work all the time. So we see repression at work when clear connections in speech are not made or refused, or when the connections are kind of like faulty. Idea is split from emotion, or emotion is split from idea. It's the whole notion of signifier. And if it's the case that there would be like an inner agency, well, this would be the perennial philosophical problem of the homunculus, of the idea that there's some kind of like little man inside who is doing repressing, who is overwatching, who is censoring things and critiquing and perhaps even motivating us in some way to do things. But it's really not the case that there is some kind of like inner agent there. Well, if it were the case, then I would be really glad, since it would only be like an issue of like stopping the repression oneself, so sort of like lifting oneself up from one's hair, like the metaphor of Munchausen says, and then we would be able to enjoy more freely sex and so on. But that's not the case for Freud. Repression is something more about ourselves in the external world, something that is outside us, I think. And yeah.
Alexandra, did you want to
Yes.
build on that or
Yes,
work with that?
Yes. Thank you so much. I think indeed this concept of repression that we dedicated to Freud's work is a much large one that contains different perspectives. And I like to talk sometimes too much and too, undifferentiated. But I can't resist of making a relation between the Nietzschean eternal return of the same and the return of the repressed. I'm sure there is a relation between this. On the other side, about the wonderful question that William provoked us to think about, if there is maybe a historical or ontological, a deeper meaning of this repression, For instance, as I remember, Marcuse is talking about basic repression and a surplus repression. So another way of understanding repression. So I think that first of all, trying to bring together all these perspectives, different perspectives about the word repression, Lacanian, Freudian, and others. I think we can't become a split subject. We can't become separated, identified ego with the body, with ideas, with feelings, with consciousness, without repression. So as Freud said, the repression is the cornerstone of psychoanalysis and of psychic processes. You can't have, without repression, without primal repression, you can't have this division between unconscious and conscious, in my opinion. So they are one, because when you talk about unconscious and conscious, it's how to say, it's implicit that something is repressed. It's implicated in this. What's repressed is in the unconscious. It is unconscious. Okay, Lacan gives a linguistic dimension to this, while Freud gives more dynamic, economic, biological dimension to this idea. But what's very interesting is, and now I try to answer in a way or to develop the question of Dimitri, what is the difference between primal and secondary repression? Urverwerf, Verdrängung und Verdrängung. Urverdrängung or primal repression, in my opinion, Dimitri, is, as you very well observed, it's pre-linguistic. And it's not so much about the singularity of the ego. It's about the structure, the very structure of the subject, of subjectivity that we all share. It's not something that has to do with you or me or or this, how to say, singular, unique human beings. It's about something that all of us are sharing. It's this pre-verbal dimension in which it's about drives, drives we can't be aware of. It's about fixation of drives. And all this stuff is unconscious, totally unconscious. Only later, when it becomes this ego to develop, it starts this ego to develop through all these mechanisms of identification and separation and whatever, then we can talk about symptomatic, neurotic, secondary repression. And then it's about my repression, your repression. And from a Lacanian point of view, and from the perspective of the three registers, as I understood, repression, primal repression, because that was the question of Dimitri, primal repression is that what makes possible becoming the real and the real register is in a way excluded in order to be instantiated the symbolic register. Because what's the real? Only this primal repression is capable of creating, in a way, the split between a real and a symbolic. So between a split subject and no thing, the real, the void. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Eric, would you like to pick up from there?
Sure. want to make 2 points. One, just to answer Alexandra, is I think we've identified at least one particular point of perhaps disagreement or different points of view on primal repression that we might be able to explore further, and that is whether or not it is verbal or pre-verbal, whether or not it involves signification in language or some other kind of representation. Because the Lacanian perspective would be, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it would be necessarily tied to the signifying chain. Whereas it seems as though the other opinion is that it's pre-verbal, but the question there is, if it's pre-verbal, how then does it get attached to the signifying chain through this condensation and displacement?
Through the first signifier. So it's just the limit between real and you are right. It's the limit, the border between the split between the real and the symbolic.
So at the inception of the symbolic, or at the inception of the I can follow you there. Yeah, I think that's good. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to is where Freud treats this topic again, and that is in chapter 4 of his paper on the unconscious, Das Unbewusste, which in the standard edition is the very next paper in that book. And in that he says that primal repression is a process that can only be found in the assumption of an anti-cathexis, by means of which the system preconscious protects itself from the pressure upon it of the unconscious idea. So I wanted to draw attention to two things there. One is the nature of which Freud is, whether metaphorically or more concretely, however we want to understand it, is understanding the notion of pressure. Okay, Drang is this notion of impulse or pressure or urge, a kind of energy that is forcing itself up towards the preconscious system in his topology. And so then there is within the preconscious a corresponding anticathexis, or a resisting pressure. And so just because when we use the word repression, it's become so conventional that we lose that actual etymological root there, the press. There is a pushing or a pressing against this corresponding pressure coming from the other side. And so there has to be this constant energy that is meeting that. And I find that very interesting because it explains, I think, or offers a metaphorical understanding. And again, the actual neurobiological mechanisms of this could be, something completely different. We're really talking about an abstraction, but it explains this constant need of energy, explains the subsequent repressions that are always occurring, but through that signifying chain that is connected with that primal repression. I find that to be really, really fascinating. But anyway, if you want a little bit extra reading on this notion of repression, check out chapter 4 of Das Unbewusste.
Thank you, Eric. I just wanted to like some things that are just on the sort of the edge of my mind, is that in this distinction that we've come across of primal repression within the discussion, I wanted to connect it to something that was in the paper that Mika suggested, where towards the end of the paper, the author suggests that man dwells too much within the symbolic, where woman does not dwell in the symbolic as much or even at all. Maybe here thinking about the signifying function as presence and absence. So like maybe that we're both right, but we have to think the presence and absence of the signifier, that the masculine view of primal repression would be it's within language. And the feminine view of primal repression would be it's not in language. So like they're both kind of right, but we're here dealing with the presence absence of the signifier. If that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense or if that like brings together these views in any way.
Can I ask something
really
about this? Yeah, it's all right, but for me it seems, I mean, observing the overall psychologicism, one could say, of our culture today, and even our current discussion, it seems somehow really tempting to think of repression as operating on some type of pre-linguistic emotional response. Why is that so tempting? That's not clear to me. Why would it be preferable?
I agree with that. Like my default, like my deep, yeah, like I guess like the way I always observe myself when I come to this question is that I'm always critical of the pre-linguistic emphasis of primal repression, and I always emphasize the linguistic dimension of it. But I was trying to think if, like, because again in that paper there was sort of this way in which, and I've heard Lacan say this as well, is the way in which when woman inhabits the signifying order as an absence, like it's through the lack of the signifier. So that, for me anyway, that would explain why someone would relate to primal repression with this disposition. It's just something I'm trying to entertain.
I think this might take us a bit off the course in our current topic, but I think that Zizek's more literal reading of Lacan's logic of sexuation is that femininity itself is defined by a full immersion into the symbolic. So woman would be more in the symbolic than man in this sense.
Exactly. So the paradox would be that the woman would emphasize the non-linguistic dimension of primal repression within language itself.
Yeah.
In the present moment.
It's Vorstellungsrepresentation. It's pointing to us the place where the discourse is lacking. It's sort of like the typical hysteric reaction that comes to mind of questioning the master, of throwing the master into doubt. It's a discursive phenomenon. And for Freud's fundamental view, there is a separation between thought and feelings in our psyche, and thought and feeling can pursue different paths. It's tricky to think in these terms. Thoughts and feelings operate in different directions, and this brings the subject to a contradictory situation where sort of like a substitute of the neurotic symptom takes the place. So I'm thinking here, for example, of the perennial example of someone having like a face mask in current pandemic, but they leave the nose like out. I think that this is kind of like a symptom.
I do this.
Since it's a symptom, I think, since on the one hand, you are driven by the moral force of the official situation of official instruction of keeping the mask on, but you also want to retain the pleasure of being able to breathe more freely.
That's exactly what I'm doing.
This compromise that you do, then it eliminates both. I mean, it's ridiculous for one, but also it's to completely eliminates the whole purpose of having the mask on. So it's keeping up the appearances with a zero benefit. And this is the sphere of the symptom which psychoanalysis deals with here, I think. Yeah, so for Freud, the first problem of repression, let's get serious. It's not a vague problem, it's a problem of truth. I mean, Freud has three main, I think, currents about repression, three questions, one could say. The problem is firstly about if something is repressed, then where is it repressed in? And this is the topographical problem, locality. And secondly, and I think this is also important, that why is it necessary to repress something? This is a separate reason, which is a dynamic problem. And thirdly, if something is repressed, then why is it? How does it stay repressed? What keeps it repressed? This is the economic problem that we are, I think, mainly focusing on. But ultimately, from the very start, I think that Lacan is definitely right, that it's always for Freud about signifying elements. It's from the very start of Freud's intellectual career to the end.
All right, I don't know what direction to go. We've got Chitan, Eric, and Alexander. So what I would suggest is, which one of you has something that's directly connected potentially to what Mika's trying to point towards here?
I just wanted to say something about the notion of truth.
Okay, fine. Eric, we'll go Eric, then Chitan, then Alexandra.
Okay, yeah. Mika brings up this notion of truth, saying that repression is ultimately about the truth. But I think it's a truth that ultimately is a nonsense. It's a truth that is nothing but the reality of the kernel of the drive. And that seems to be what Paul Verhaeghe was saying in that paper. That ultimately the end of analysis is coming to the simple truth that there is no truth, or the simple truth of the drive itself, which I think is a very Hegelian kind of way of looking at it. You know, absolute knowing is coming to this realization that the absolute is this contradiction, is this gap in knowledge. And so there is no truth that is a something that we can uncover, and that's just as Paul Verhaeghe knows, that's just the continuation of the signifying chain, just keeping going and going and going to this interminable analysis. But we finally come to the truth, and what is the truth is that there is no truth. It's just the drive itself.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm currently writing something where I've tried to make this exact same connection that you're making here between sort of the end of analysis as this kernel of the drive and absolute knowing being that they overlap. It's like almost philosophy and stuff, like Hegel takes you through the path of becoming a philosopher, and psychoanalysis is trying to bring everyone to that position concretely through analytics work or something like that. I don't know. I see them as very synergistic. But sorry about the Chitan. Are you still here or no? Chitan's left. So we'll go Alexandra, then William.
Yes. To answer to this question of pre-verbal or verbal, first of all, it's about a little baby, a newborn who does not speak. So that's my argument, that it is pre-verbal. Secondly, it's about that baby that has no identity. The baby is the other, it's the mother, it's the gaze of the mother, the touch of the mother. There is no difference between them. It's totally fusional. And that's the real, that's the perfect word, as Cadell said. It's in the womb, the heaven. And then there is this, how to say, this expulsion, in German, Ausstoßung. And in my opinion, this expulsion, Ausstoßung, is in the same time like a Caesar, in the same time with the affirmation, with the Freudian Bejahung. They can't be separated. So in the very moment the expulsion is produced, and the gap, the very gap, the nothingness between a new identity, the newborn baby, the baby, and the mother, who is all desiring and very powerful mother. Yes, a phallic mother, you can say if you want. So these two moments are one moment. The very beginning of a new me, the baby, this Ausstoßung, and the Bejahung. Yes, there is a gap, there is something different than the mother. So that's why I said it's not about speaking here. It's before speaking, it's about very elemental stimuli, drive stimuli, oral, anal, whatever.
But then you are not
Functional.
talking about repression anymore. You are not talking about repression here
Now
anymore.
that's the primal repression.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
And the other one is coming, the secondary repression is coming and fixing through different signifiers and different chains of signifiers, the symptom related to oral drive, anal drive, and other drives, gaze and evocatory and sexual and so on. I'm talking as a physician from a semiological medical point of view.
Yeah, but I don't see any point in this discussion connecting to our discussion of repression here today.
Okay, sorry then.
I mean, you could explain how the infant situation is connected to repression, but then you would have to focus on the Oedipal drama, which you are bypassing with the whole
and,
mystifying tendency of
Nika.
yours.
And about the Oedipal drama, it's about the father. Lacan brings this idea of the first signifier, as very well Eric explained, that the first signifier is that cut between the mother and the baby, that interdiction, and the first signifier then that Lacan develops as the name of the father later, or the function of the father. That in our culture now is weak, as Cadell observed. So, yeah, that's the way I understood, but I think there are many ways of understanding this, these mechanisms, even it's not the best word, of primal and secondary repression. But without a primal pre-verbal repression, you can't have all the other repressions. Yeah, which are, as you said, too, I think, Mika, it has to do with truth, because Lacan said that unconscious is structured like a language. So this theory that in the unconscious, there is a condensation and displacement and coming together of all kinds of ideas that are separated from affects. This is very encouraging for this idea that in the unconscious there is a melting, a transforming of senses from a linguistic perspective, a Lacanian one, in this unconscious. Chains of signifiers through all these mechanisms of unconscious logic, very different of conscious one, are creating new symptoms, displacements, shifts of symptoms, and so on, that manifests in neurotic, for instance, as we saw.
Okay, I just want to make sure we get to William and then Chitin afterwards, but thank you a lot, Alexander, for your interpretation. William, are you there?
I'm on. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted. I just want to go back to this idea of repression. Eric, I think what you said about opposition and as being an expression of repression is very interesting, and that's my experience of it too. I mean, why do we seem to have so much inner conflict, and why do we? My experience of opposition is this sense of pushing away or warding off. And it's just so interesting how our psychic life functions. So, I guess one thing I'd like to try to understand is, because you talked a little bit about, in your talk about pre-conscious and unconscious. I guess from what Freud's paper is saying here is that we really don't know what we're repressing. And this brings me to another kind of thought I had on your talk, was the idea of our statements never really being integrated. Like if we say, at least in the Freudian universe, if we say, I really love this person, often it means the opposite, or the opposite is missing, or there's something that's not entirely true. It's the question of the integrated object. And sometimes I feel that unless we got into what we're repressing or denying, we're not really reaching an integrated position. So practically every statement everyone makes, either in hate or in love, is never the full story. So, I mean, I guess this brings us to a simple question to you is, how would you understand integration? Because if we're so split, if we're so in denial and so repressed, most of our statements aren't really the whole truth.
Is that to me?
Yeah.
So,
or everyone generally, but I mean, I'm just curious because the issue of integration, for me, integration, as someone who's been in therapy, it seems to be an important term to understand. When do we reach an integrated position with ourselves, with our statements, with our emotions, with others, etc.?
To me, it's the subject's relation to contradiction. Like, and that's related to the idea of, like, at least I'm playing with the idea that the end of analysis and Hegel's absolute knowing are somehow related to each other, but it's sort of like a perspectival shift on contradiction. So like when you say, for example, when I was 25, I put a huge emphasis on telling my girlfriend that I loved her. Like it was a huge moment, like I was going to say it, and when I say it, everything's going to be changed and we're going to be integrated together and all that. And then a year later, she breaks up with me and I have feelings of hate and I have feelings of great turmoil, and my entire identity is being ripped apart and stuff like that. So it's like coming to the level, like, and now with my partner, it's more that I'm capable of seeing the ways in which, I'm oscillating. I'm a constant oscillating contradiction, and I can hold that emotionally. So that's sort of how I understand integration, is that you don't become integrated by becoming one unified identity. You become integrated by becoming something that can hold many different identities, but within some sort of real.
Yeah, that's ambivalence. I mean, that's the classic definition of integration. Good and bad parts, love and hate. You can hold the opposites, or you can hold those two together. But I guess that when people are making these kind of absolutes in politics or in relations, then that's the repressed side is missing, because they can't talk about the opposite.
Yeah, that's how I think. Yeah. At least. Does anyone else want to respond to that? There might be different opinions on that, and it's a pretty important question, I think.
I think the notion of therapeutic treatment would be interesting to go on, but I will let others speak here. Yeah.
I was just going to remark, and Cadell, I think your answer is exactly right. And I think we could bring in Freud's Verneinung negation into that discussion as well, where it's precisely by negating the unconscious idea that it actually is able to come into consciousness. But I also think a part of that integration is where the signifying chain actually connects together. And that's where we can actually follow it through analysis to find that nexus point of the kernel of the drive. We just have to think about Freud's many examples, like the repression of Signorelli, and how that connects in a chain of signifiers down to some traumatic kernel. And so I think there's a point of integration, at least along that signifying chain.
William, did you want to respond to that, or any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, we'll go to Chetan.
No, I think everything's been pretty cleared up. Thank you.
Alexander, you're muted, I think.
Okay.
Your audio's not coming through, at least for me.
You hear me? You
Yeah,
don't?
now you're coming through.
Sorry. Yes, William, I think this word integration is a very delicate one, because it has in a way, it idealizes maybe a unity. And that's the question, if this unity is an ideal or just a myth. I don't know. Because in a way, we are always we have ontologically an incompleteness, I think. So if we want to deal with this integration, total integration, it's not about little integrations, but some perfect unity, let's say. I think it's not possible without apophatic approach, the real, as Cadell said. So becoming a space holder for different identities, different hypostases of different ideas, things, just observing them in a contemplative state, how they come and go, and just staying in between them. So for me, that's...
it is possible then, or?
It is possible, but in this dimension of no thing.
Oh, so we are in a region of totalitarianism, or?
You are identified
Sorry.
with the body. In my opinion, it's not possible, a total integration.
So it's not impossible.
It's not, in my opinion, it's not possible, but we have to develop this state of being capable of becoming a space holder for as much as possible so-called opposite, ambivalent identities. But in the same time, what's very interesting and what helps a lot for this is psychoanalysis. Why? Because while in conscious everyday life, we use very often this logic of opposites, contradiction, yes, no, good, bad. In the unconscious logic, it's used similarity, mimesis logic. It's about homonyms, about resonance. It's another kind of logic. Like in the rat man, the word rat has to do with a lot of signifiers that are correlated by the similarity of rats, included in all these very different words. So it's a totally different kind of logic. And that's why through psychoanalysis, when you become aware of something you were unaware, this tension, what Eric was speaking about, this pressure, this sufferance, always being fatigue and with symptoms, is liberated, because you become conscious of these mechanisms, of your own symptom. Why is it like that, I think?
I want to say that I interrupted you because this is exactly the point where Lacanian psychoanalysis diverts from this, I would assume it's kind of like a layman psychology, where there is the search for a kind of like integrated man, the new man. That's not Lacanian psychoanalysis. I think that's some kind of, I think, lay personality and so on. But
yes,
I also the kind of like temptation of building this type of like a new, more integrated person, of new man. It's at the very roots of every totalitarian regime. They always promise that.
Yes, you're right.
It's sort of a fantasy that appeals to certain personality.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to emphasize this idea of a new integrated man at the root of every totalitarian regime. It's important to think through deeply. also like some ideas that come into my head from our talk on the phenomenology of spirit. I think one of the problems with coming to this notion of the identity and contradiction and making room for other identities, what we really have to be careful of, I think, is something Mika also brought up, of that doesn't mean therefore that anything goes, or that any identity goes, or that, you know, just total contradiction, like in an absurd sense, you know, like it's, I think there has to be a more intelligent way to talk about the play of identities in order to avoid, I think, at least in my interpretation, I could be completely wrong, but in order to avoid, in my interpretation, a kind of like a anti-Oedipal schizoid landscape where, you know, it's kind of like a free for all of identities, and like it's just like this mess of identity. I think, at least in my experience, or what I'm playing with actively, is trying to find the contradiction of the present moment of my identity, which is in some sort of impossible tension, which needs an escape, which needs an outlet, and to try to actually engage in some sort of intellectual project where that other identity has space to breathe, has a place for that other identity, has a sort of constructive outlet in some sense. Maybe Chitan, you want to go over, and then Mika, we'll go to Mika after that.
I think Mika, if you want to go, you can go first. Yeah.
No, I would prefer for you to go first.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to talk actually. I just logged in to hear you guys, and something I heard and I wanted to talk, and that's how it goes. I was out for dinner with friends. I completely forgot about it. Okay. Actually, okay. On the question of integration, actually, there's an important discussion to be had that today we find so difficult to think about these questions of integration, synthesis, and all those kind of terms, because actually we don't have a theory of one anymore. We don't, at some point we didn't have a theory of zero. Zero was this really abstract number for us. Today, that especially post psychoanalysis, we do not know how to understand one. So one is always 1 plus 1 minus. There's always an excess and a lack attached to it. The challenge is actually, is the only way possible to recognize one by covering that gap? Is one always recognized through a cover of that gap? Or is there another way to associate with the one in which that gap is not just covered? I think that's the challenge. If what Cadell is sort of throwing at us in a very serious manner, it is connected to the contradiction in some senses. So can we only recognize the one when we are covering the gap? Or is there any other way to do it?
Yeah. I think that I love the way you're framing this, and I just want to say that there's a fantastic I'm going to find the link and put it in the description for everyone before it's over, but there's a fantastic seminar conference by Žižek, Zupancic, and Dollar about the one divides into two. And they go into full detail about this problem of the one, and takes it back to Parmenides and taking it back to the original notion of the one and so forth. And at least what I can understand from Ladin Dollar's position is that the real challenge here is, if philosophy is the philosophy of the one ultimately, then psychoanalysis tries to think the other. And this is the challenge to me with the contradiction of identity, is the challenge of the other. I don't know how you relate to that or what you think of that. I'm going to try and find the link anyway for that. And if in any case anyone wants to watch it,
I would want to listen to it actually. No, and you're actually right. That's the challenge essentially, because the challenge is, one is, because it's very easy to say that we enter into pure multiplicity. And we know there's a problem there, as Mika pointed out, that then pure multiplicity is actually a simple domination of the many in that sense. That doesn't work. And the problem is that if we want to find a way forward from the multiplicity, we have to affirm the split. That is how we normally talk about in psychoanalytic language. But what do we mean by affirming the split? What we mean by affirming the split is actually to find a new way to look at the one. We cannot find a ground in this permanent suspicion of the one also. Essentially, we cannot ground ourselves thinking that there's a permanent suspicion of the one can function in that sense. Eventually, as thinkers, as people, we need to ground the one back in the split itself. And that's that's the real work that you need to do, the real dirty work.
It is. I agree. There's just one thing I want to say about this grounding the one back into the split, in something related to what Alexandra was saying when she was talking about the split between the conscious and the unconscious, is that in my experience, it's possible to be the split itself. It's possible to be the cut itself. At least I've had intimations of this, but I don't know. And it's, to me, it's connected with a very overwhelming bodily sensation.
I wonder if this is Freud's view, or if it's something that Freud would characterize in some different way than what you are putting forward. So I would like to bring this discussion also back to repression. It's not that we overcome repression entirely in this. We are not outside symbolic, even if we achieve some type of, one could say, elating experience in our own psychic economy sometimes. But really, I think we should stress the fact that repression doesn't come really from deep within us. It's as I said earlier, it's something that's external. It's a kind of like, one could say, an external intimacy or extimacy, as Lacan puts it. So the viewpoint of repression should be that it's not something that it's not that we refuse to know something or we refuse to recognize something. The very master key is always there at the surface. It's there always at place, but in a transposed and translated into neurotic language. And if we think about repression as some kind of like horrible or violent event that takes place, then we miss the surface level of the experience of repression. I mean, I would like to also here read Freud's words when he describes how he takes the lesson from neurosis, from studying neurosis, to involve his understanding of repression. He says that influenced by our study of the psychoneurosis, we see its profound effects we tend to overestimate the psychological impact of repression, and we forget too easily that it does not prevent the drive representative from continuing to exist in the unconscious, from undergoing further organization, from forming derivatives, or from making new connections. So tell me if it's not the case that Freud is here not really like interested in big psychological events. He's not looking for some kind of grand trauma within the subject, which could explain somehow their misery, their existence. He's only looking for connections. He's only looking for what could be spoken in terms of nodal points, of structural necessities and intersections, and those are really what characterizes the Freudian unconscious. And Freud calls these the kind of like switch words, which are junctures or shift points in a network. So when Freud is here saying that it doesn't prevent from the drive to making new connections, the connections are already there, and the subject just refuses to make these connections. And I really love the way that Freud gives here also a good description on the next page about the process of analysis. When applying the technique of psychoanalysis, we continually ask the patient to produce derivatives of the repressed that are sufficiently remote or distorted to get past the censorship of the conscious. Precisely these are the associations that we demand he produce. So it's a kind of a work. While abandoning all conscious intentions and all criticism and from which we reproduce a conscious translation of the repressed represented. So it's a kind of a translation what the analyst gives. It's not some type of like big revelation of what goes on within the psyche. And I think that this is what gets lost mostly in our loose and vague discussion about repression in our current era of psychologicism, our blabberings about psychological states and models and everything.
Okay, William, did you want to go from there?
Yeah, I could just want to. Yeah, extimacy is a very, very interesting kind of idea, and maybe someone could elaborate that for me, because I don't really understand. I just came across the term recently. I guess I want to say something a little bit about repression. Because this idea of pressure, opposition, contradiction, and I think for me, Freud, and then this is my reading of him, is that he's really fundamentally a doctor, and he doesn't like seeing people suffer. That's my opinion of him. And so I think he's always looking for ways to how to deal with how to address the problem of human suffering. This is just my interpretation. And it's very clear that we all suffer because we all have inner conflicts, and these inner conflicts, I'm thinking of Karen Horney's work, our inner conflicts, and it's the basis of our neurosis and what we define as neurosis. And at the same time, there's this other aspect which Freud unleashes or unearths, which is the unconscious, which he says never says no. The unconscious never says no. So why are we walking around with yes and no and having conflicts and arguing and getting into fighting and all this suffering and all this stuff? And yet at the same time, there's something there that is completely doesn't have these problems. And why are we stuck in this neurotic apparatus instead of something more fundamental? And I think for me, this is like what Freud is kind of like giving in some sense, and I don't think he ever resolves it, but I just think I'm thinking of Deleuze, of course, when he talks about, when he looks at difference and repetition, for example, he talks about opposition is the big problem in thought. Why the hell have we been so stuck in it? Why do we always go into yes, no, I agree, why are we so caught up in these binaryisms? And so I'm just wondering where repression falls in all of this. Like, is that something that we should try to kind of get beyond or keep? I mean, on a personal level, no, I think it's necessary to keep repression, but really to think about it in terms of, what Freud was talking about in terms of the unconscious. And there's no other language, which has been mentioned here. The unconscious speaks a completely different language than the conscious. And it might be more important for us to follow that language in order to get beyond all of this, neurotic conflict.
Okay, I think there's a lot there. I also want to get to Eric. What do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I guess a bit on Cadell, your remark about Deleuze and anti-Oedipus. One thing I wanted to bring in here, connecting with that, and also with the Verhege paper, is that at the end of analysis, the point of the end of analysis, where we uncover all of the repressions, and we see this kernel of the drive, and that at that point we have to follow Lacan when he says the non-duped air, because I think it's tempting for us to, when we come to this truth of non-truth, to say, well, there's no sexual relation, so the hell with it, right? Love isn't real. And that for Lacan is to go astray, to err. And so we have to allow ourselves to be duped by the possibility of the sexual relation, so that we will actually construct this symptomal something in that gap in order to build something of a life. And I think that is precisely where this, to kind of build upon what William was saying, is the alleviating of suffering is not in the analytical process. It's precisely where we go from that process in the synthetic construction of what Frege was calling a neo-ego, this something, the symptom that we construct in that space, in that gap. And so we can't just dwell in the non-relation or the non-truth without duping ourselves and trying to then reconstruct something in that place.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that's connected to some of the things that Mika's also emphasized. And how I want to approach with where I really think there's so much at stake in the way Deleuze and Guattari relate to Freud, and the way in which I think also Deleuze relates to Hegel. That I really think that it was really careless what they did. Or maybe it's not careless what they did. Maybe it's not them that's the problem. But in any case, the way it's been interpreted and carried out and sort of instantiated in institutional frameworks, because the biggest problem in my view, and I think we touched on this very centrally in our Phenomenology of Spirit talk, is that the point is not to identify with Hegel or Freud or something like that. But the point is that there is something to be gained by working through Hegel and Freud authentically. And I think that that's lost in the generation that have read, for example, Deleuze or Foucault, and then think, oh, well, I don't have to read Hegel and Freud then. Oh, well, Hegel and Freud are just idiots then. I think that there is something deeply lost there. And I think it shows in our culture. I think it shows in the immaturity of our culture. So
I think it's interesting that at the end of Lacan's life, after he had really gone so far beyond Freud, left Freud in the dust in a lot of ways, he said, I'll leave it to you to be Lacanians, but as for me, I'm a Freudian.
Exactly. And I think that Lacan is a perfect intellectual embodiment of how one should relate to the paternal signifier or a certain symbolic order, that he's not cheaply deconstructing or negating it. He's working through it. He's paying respect to it, not so that he can become symmetrical with it, but so that he can actually go somewhere where the father didn't go. I think that I don't know, that's my interpretation of the difference between the way Lacan and Deleuze relate to these figures. Mika, did you have your hand up, or should I leave?
Oh yeah, I did. I'm not sure anymore how to connect this, but I wanted to sort of just show you a kind of picture that Lacan gives in the end of his first seminar about the process of analysis. So it's that kind of like a looping motion approaching the nucleus of the symptom and so on. So here he is saying that following the fundamental rule of free association, it opens up the subject to this fertile mistake through which genuine speech joins up once again with the discourse of error. But also when speech flees from revelation, from fertile error, and develops into deception, what is discovered are those points which in the subject's history have not been integrated yet, taken on, but repressed. In the course of analysis, the subject develops what is his truth, his integration into his history. His integration, he is history. But there are some holes in the history where what had been verworfen or verdrängt took place. Jumping ahead a little bit, what is discovered in this constant looping motion of the analytic process are some kind of imaginary captivations by imaginary fixations, which were at the moment unassimilable to the symbolic development of his history. This means that it was traumatic. What is involved in analysis? That the subject be able to totalize the various accidents of memory of which is retained in the big other in the form of closed off from him. It opens only up through verbalization. That's to say, through the mediation of the other, the analyst. It is through the spoken assumption of his history that the subject becomes committed to the path of bringing into being this truncated imaginary. I find this really good quote. I mean, it was a long quote in discussion of repression. Repression is the case that something functions like off the stage in the form of a symptom. And what is to be analyzed? What's to be analyzed is just nothing else but one's own history, which is highly individual. It's radically personal. What will take place? What's the aim of analysis? What's the purpose? It's all radically personal. I think this escaped the critiques of Freud, really, and also it escaped the cookie cutter workflow models of psychology that were developed after Freud. There is no 12-step program for psychoanalysis. You cannot say what it means. What does it mean to go into analysis? But it's going to involve a prolonged and careful examination of one's own history always. And there are always points which elude oneself if you try it, if you go to it. And it's a process that's, if you are going to do it, potentially it goes on forever. But at some point you feel that my history is less incomprehensible. So that's a benefit, I think, clearly.
I can just relate to that in a way that might be helpful for viewers who are coming to psychoanalysis, maybe from a scientific point of view or a scientific worldview, which is that when I analyzed my own intellectual history, I realized that I was actually always obsessed with origins. So I spent a lot of time in my undergraduate studying the evolution of humans, the evolution of life, the evolution of the universe. But where that left me was without a careful examination of my own personal history. And so that's where I came to psychoanalysis. And so I think that this is something that's really, I think, as Lacan always emphasized, that psychoanalysis is not reducible to science, but something that's made possible within a scientific universe, that it becomes necessary for people to do deeper self-search and for people to do a more careful examination of their own history. And that, you know, I don't know, where does that bring us as a society? I don't think we really know, but but I think it's also important for political projects and thinking about something beyond a post-capitalist world or some higher social order within a capitalist world, whatever it happens to be. That we have a deeper understanding of our own individual idiosyncratic histories and we have spaces to hold them. I think any political project, and that's why I think this paper on repression, it has so much to say about, or has so much to add to the way we potentially think about politics and the way our political conflicts are really like, you know, absurd distortions of much deeper self issues.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, even from like really common sense perspective, when you look at what is involved in politics, it's always personal histories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, Alexandra, and then Chetan.
Thank you, Kadel, for the wonderful words you said about, again, using the word integrating, about integrating or accepting your roots, your personal origin. What do you think, could I introduce, because you used the word idiosyncratic, could I introduce a strange word for psychoanalytical context here, like forgiving? Can forgiving has something to do with accepting your repressed, things that you repressed by understanding, and in a way forgiving to father, mother, I don't know, grandmother, or forgiving is an interdiction to be used in this context?
I'll just relate personally that I hope that the more I understand myself, the more of a forgiving person I'll be capable of being. But the way I'm handling that personally is that I don't want to forgive if it's not quote unquote authentic, meaning that if I forgive someone on the surface of my consciousness, but in my unconscious I'm still radically torn, then it would be false for me to forgive in that sense. But I don't have to be against the person. I just have to withdraw from the person in order to figure out my own unconscious and how I'm relating to the past. And like Mika was saying, to give a careful analysis of my own personal history. And when I come to the space where I can authentically forgive and be in that space, then I will take responsibility on myself for that entire process. That's how I'm trying to handle it.
Yes, thank you. So you accept this word. And it's
I
about
do.
about becoming conscious through psychoanalytical process. You become able to forgive to yourself too. I think some kind of this repressed emotions, this repressed ideas. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but one should be careful to say this. That forgiveness is a very, very late fruit. It doesn't come. It doesn't come early.
I am also reminded in this connection of the way that Lacan confronted the student rioting public in 68. I mean, the public was sort of like demanding that they'd be freed from all masters and able to enjoy more freely and so on. So what did Lacan say to them? He sort of like stated that the aim of analysis is just to introduce more shame.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he say something in that context that they were looking for new masters? Right,
yeah. And Zizek makes the good point that they were celebrating perversion.
Yes.
As somehow like revolutionary, and dismissing hysteria as I don't know, as bourgeois, or I don't know.
Yeah, and what I've come to appreciate in Zizek's work on perversion is that he identifies perversion as linked to power, like the perversion like power exploits perversion. Perversion is slavery.
Exactly. Yeah, and power law itself might have always some sort of external connection to perverts, a pervert relation.
I think it's just that if someone is living out and identifying too strongly with a perverted fantasy, it's a maybe the biggest trap. I don't know, because it's direct, immediate enjoyment, but at the same time, it's what is the social context in which that fantasy is being acted out? I mean, what needs as a whole person are you sort of sacrificing?
Isn't the fantasy exactly conscious representation of something without repression? Isn't that their fantasy?
Yes, I think that's what's missed I think that's what's driving, at least in my discussion. I mean, I'm really talking to people who are like deeply reading anti-Oedipus and stuff like that, and Deleuze and so forth. And I've read Difference in Repetition and Anti-Oedipus. What I think that is the fantasy driving it is this idea of a social space where perverted fantasies can exist without repression. I don't know if I'm right, but that's what I sense. This idea of a social space free of totalitarian, any sort of social constraint. Chitan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to take the discussion somewhere else, but
Go take it wherever you like.
okay. Yeah. But actually, Deleuze is a very interesting figure in this in these discussions, and but we can I wanted to actually take it back to that question that was being asked at that time, which was whether I think primal depression is pre-linguistic or not. Was that the discussion, Carol? Is that what we were discussing at that time?
Yes, it's had quite a bit of back and forth on that idea.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask in that sense, what do we mean by pre-linguistic over there? I just wanted to raise that problem in some senses, that what do we exactly know? If we take the question of the gap seriously, we would immediately see that the gap itself is structured like a language. The gap itself is not completely, if it had no relationship with language, language would never emerge. The problem of language emerges itself because gap itself is giving you the linguistic dimension, which is why linguistic dimension in psychoanalysis is not simply a human language issue. Language is an issue of the very drive itself in many senses. And
isn't the idea or conception of free-linguistic cognition, it's another name for Vorstellungsrepräsentanz.
Come again, Nika? Sorry?
For Freud's Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. It's just another name for that, I think.
Explain yourself, Mika. I can't.
Yeah, the idea that there might be some kind of like pre-linguistic cognition of things. I think that it's just pointing towards where Freud was more precise with connection to original Urverträngung and so on.
Yeah, I think we need.
I mean, it's a discursive move. It's a move in discourse to say even these things, to even point like towards some point. kind of like lack in discourse. It's a gap in discourse that needs to be filled out by some signification. That's what I meant.
Yeah, I think there's deep spiritual implications for this problem, and maybe why we oscillate on it and talk about it is because there is a way, like, for example, during my doctorate, I would say that all of the people within my discipline who were like scientifically minded, they had come to the notion of some sort of Buddhist spirituality as their spirituality, and some sort of notion of a silence, and some sort of notion of a pre-linguistic origin, and identified with that. But I think that is a move that is trying to get out of the violence or the conflict or the tension inherent in being within language, or the gap of dealing with that immersion in language, and like this withdrawal from language as kind of like this, almost like a, I don't know, I don't want to say cowardly, but I did say cowardly.
I mean, I would even not go that far. I would say that it's a certain way of making one's appearance in the discourse.
I actually agree with Mika over there to some degree. If we have to take the word pre-linguistic seriously, so one is this fantasy of the pre-linguistic, there exists something beyond language. There is a fantasy of that kind, that there is something that can completely escape language, something in which we can get some knowledge, leaving that fantasy aside, which is, in some sense silly also. And if we take the word seriously, it actually can have different meanings in different contexts. For instance, if I'm in a certain therapy session, or I'm with an analyst, pre-linguistic can actually mean a point in in this process of integration, in which the analyst and actually experiences or have a brush with a form of reality which exists outside a signifying chain, in which he is able to engage with the gap of his own discourse and his own linguistic. Until that point, pre-linguistic word works fine, I think. But when we start using pre-linguistic as a word to mean something that ontologically predates language in some senses. That doesn't give rise to another signifying chain. I think we enter into a trap there.
Yeah, it's an empty
Yeah.
representation.
Yeah.
Nothing comes to mind. And
nothing comes to mind. So when we
Yeah.
start thinking in terms of primal, is primal repression outside? Is primal repression pre-linguistic? The question can become moot very fast, because if you think about primal repression, what is it? It's a very interesting problem in some senses. Primal repression is that point in the functioning of drive in which can actually collect all content which is associated with it. That is why repression doesn't function only through the force of the ego or the consciousness back into the unconscious. It actually functions because primal repression attracts that content. And once it's not able to attract that content, once it comes in ideas, then it needs other ways to repress it, which is, you have to change the form of it. Love becomes hate. Those kind of ways that your ego starts using those kind of ways. But the primal repression actually has to attract what is being repressed for things to be repressed. Repression is not only a negative force; it is also a positive force at that.
Yeah, we've emphasized that.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I meant also by emphasizing that repression is always the case of substitution. So it's this extremely mobile substitution.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you start taking that seriously, then this question of pre-linguistic becomes moot very fast, because you may not be able to articulate in what context are we saying it's pre-linguistic. Under what conditions.
Yes.
Well, otherwise, it will always enter into language, because all your unconscious content that you have is still within the domain of language in some sense. It's still within the domain of some signifying chain. That is how it's able to find its underlife. Freud is right that there is an underlife to all these. All things are playing their own roles, even when they're not coming into your consciousness. All these instincts of yours, which are repressed, are still playing their own. They have their own life and their own roles over there, which are playing, underneath. It's just that they have not come into your consciousnness, and thus they can't resolve themselves at that level, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. I was thinking that maybe we should could we think of this as exactly what is meant by the signifier of the lack of the other. I mean, the S and the big A order being crossed within. Yeah.
I just want to make sure we get to Dimitri, and then Alexandra, I think, had her hand raised as well.
Yeah. Question is yet again pretty simple, and it's not related to well, basically it is, what's the relationship between shame and repression? Because Kadal, you were talking about this, to simplify it, like this Deleuzian ideal of just releasing the perversities outside and I guess being without shame. So I wonder, is shame of the truth? Or what is that feeling exactly in regards to repression?
I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that. I don't know if I have a good answer.
I think that shame has to do with the capacity of becoming aware that you projected on somebody else, transforming that person in a scapegoat for your own unconscious symptom. So in a way, shame is the emotional reaction of somebody who accepts that it's about him, not about it depends what are you ashamed of, but maybe you are ashamed of punishing and considering guilty of somebody else by projecting somebody on somebody else. I don't know.
I the way I think about it, and this might be kind of a naive notion of repression, but it seems like it's a failure of repression in some way, that the consciousness becomes aware of its inconsistent symptom or some ambiguity, and then it cannot bear this.
What is
Actually,
really unbearable in this is that maybe it's just totally idiosyncratic. What does it mean to have a shame in certain situation? So if you were to like try to get to the meaning of being ashamed at something, you would have to go through several different disconnected associations, signifying chains, and then search for some kind of link between them. That would be my 2 cents, but maybe we can, I don't know.
I remember Agamben writing about shame, actually. I don't exactly remember, the arguments placed over there. But I think if we take the simple structure of shame intact, and then maybe we can think further from there collectively. Shame is, when your inside becomes visible to the outside. If you think about it, that's the point of shame, isn't it? When something that is inside, whether it's and human beings understand that to form a certain social organization, they need to keep their inside separate. They need to keep their inside covered in some senses. And, and and the breakthrough of shame always is that can you make, in what conditions can you make your inside accessible to the outside, in which it doesn't, and there, of course, your question is very valid, that repression, of course, plays a role in keeping that inside out of the social sphere in that sense. But how do we think further from that? Of course, once the repressed content moves away, we have to encounter shame to be able to integrate it. That is, I think, pretty obvious to all of us when we accept the structure in that sense, because we all have to confront our insight for that some kind of integration to happen. But beyond that, I think shame has a lot of other dimensions also, which we would need to, and there's a lot of work done upon this, which we cannot just discuss in this manner. But I'm sure that there's a lot of thinking about the problem of shame in its social and cultural dimensions, and how do we sort of engage with them, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and it's also about hiding and revealing. So the shame is when somebody what was hidden becomes visible to yourself or to the other. And it's not in itself important. It's just a step toward becoming more conscious about something, I think. But what I wanted to say, and then I finish, Chetan, about this pre-verbal, I have a question. When I was using pre-verbal, I was thinking about the very little baby who has no conscious or about himself as being separate from the mother. It's not, that's maybe it's a language there. I don't know. That was my concept attached to this very little newborn baby that does not speak, in that sense.
Yeah, but language is not only about speaking in that sense. If we take Lacan's, even if we take Cecil seriously, language is, and even Ronald Barthes seriously, language is not just about speaking. Language actually emerges in the very process of signification itself.
Can I just say on this, language is not just about speaking point is like, do dogs speak?
No.
Are they affected
bark.
by are they affected by signification?
They belong in the human world, and they might also be neurotic.
Absolutely.
But the point about language in Lacan is it's more fundamental. And I mean, it concerns the ways that kinship relations operate in human world. It's very different from animal world. I mean, we are not animals. We are humans who live in a symbolic world. And in our symbolic world, I mean, everything from pissing to shitting to eating and fucking, always symbolically mediated in some way or other. And when the baby comes to world, most usually the parents already have a word, a name.
That's what I was trying to get at.
That's symbolic. That's language. That's
exactly.
And it's going to orient the baby. It's going to form the way that baby functions in the world. And the baby is either going to reject castration and become psychotic, or then baby becomes neurotic. And it's a terrible situation. But sorry,
you are talking about the perspective of the other. I'm talking about
what?
As being me, that baby.
As being the baby.
Yes, the baby.
Being the baby.
Yes, it's
Let's
a baby. You are the baby.
Wow.
And you don't talk. You don't talk. So it's a phenomenological.
The baby tries to talk. I mean, they try to imitate
first person.
already.
It's first person perspective.
But the symbolic, I mean, what you might not understand is that the symbolic exists. The symbolic is there. You Alexander doesn't seem to understand that the symbolic does take place before even birth.
But not for the baby.
Yeah, but the baby's
For the
imaginary
others?
is just the chaos at the beginning.
I remember,
For Lacan, the baby has a real and a symbolic, but no imaginary. Imaginary comes later.
Okay.
And you are stuck in the imaginary.
I think
I have a problem with that. I have to.
Alexander, I still take your point. To be honest to you, I agree that maybe we have widened the definition of language too much. That is a valid critique. You know, I'll not get away from it. That maybe we have, because my own training is in linguistics, and maybe we have widened, and whether we have good reasons to do that theoretically or not, where do we go from there? Those discussions we can have. But I remember Ilinka Zupanchik writing this in her What is Sex book. It's a brilliant sort of small section over there, which he articulates that man and language in that sense is, man and animal are not two opposite things, where humans have something and animals don't. Humans are an end point, of this revealing of the gap itself. Humans cannot actually go back and cover that gap anymore. We have to confront it in that sense. And that what you call that meeting point actually is symbolic. Yeah, so Kelly, you want to say something?
Yeah, because I think Alenka Zupan, the best way she said it was, animals are finite and humans are finite, but humans can't even be finite. Like we struggle, like we wrestle with our own finitude in a way that animals don't. So it's not like a positive function, but more like a certain way in which finitude gets structured in the symbolic order, which drives us insane.
Because there is something that relies fully in the human being, which is also there in animals. So it's not a mere opposition. It's actually a contrast that through which we see things in that sense. And I think that there is something to be thought through within. If we take that claim seriously, then we can see a child in a similar manner also. The challenge is that are we imposing a certain idea of language that we have upon other beings? My students ask it regularly to me whenever I sort of have the discussion in a classroom in India. That's an immediate question that comes to us, that are we being what we call anthropocentric in some senses? And is there a way to escape anthropocentrism if we have to completely affirm the human unconscious? Those are I think important issues that we would have to
That's the catchword. That's the catchword today, like anthropocentrism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's the issue with the idea of a centered subject, I think. And in Lacan, we have already, I mean, in Freud, if we read Lacan, we have a theory of radically extimate subject, of radically decentered subject. I mean, Lacan basically thinks about language as this external system that's, it might apply even to some kind of like alien life form.
No, Mika, it's not that easy, but even if it applies to an alien life form, for example, if it applies to a dog, you would still need to think through the problem that why does the human become center to that form of looking at the other in that sense? Because we do not we cannot claim to have a direct experience of being a dog. Isn't it? There's a point.
So if the problem is that why humans become a center, I think that this is a separate problem.
Devil's advocate. Actually, I'm in your team. I debate that. When I debate that over here, I give your arguments to everybody else. So I'm just being devil's advocate. But I'm just raising that question in a serious manner, that we cannot have that experience of being a dog or a dolphin. at least that is how somebody would frame that problem for us.
So like this is like Thomas Nagel has a very famous paper titled "What is it like to be a bat?"
Yeah.
Just asking the question, can philosophy answer this question? Well, how should or even like the pre frame, like, can philosophy even, like, is it sensical for philosophy to even ask this question?
Exactly. And that's where we get stuck at in that sense. I personally think that there's a way to ask that question. My personal view is that there is a way to ask that question. We cannot, if we truly affirm dialectics in some senses, we cannot affirm this division between self and the other as complete. There's a point at which we can just raise our hand and say dialectics doesn't work anymore. Basically, that's what we're doing, isn't it? If we are claiming that there is no way to gain this, move beyond this step, we are saying that there's a point beyond which the dialectic movement doesn't work. There's a point beyond which self and other are. Well,
you know how this is becoming very, and this is what I like about philosophy and why I think philosophy is so important today, is because philosophy is becoming more and more concrete, meaning the questions that people would say, like you can imagine when Thomas Nagel produced that paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" that someone in his department, in like the biology department or something, would be like, "Oh, why do we even have philosophers asking this question? Like, why do we waste our money on a philosopher asking himself, what is it like to be a bat? This is a totally useless question," and so forth. But I think that these questions are becoming more and more concrete in the sense that there are scientists thinking about, could we, through biomimicry, recreate the sense of echolocation, for example? Like, could we through biomimicry have human beings that actually experience echolocation and like some, but still I would argue on some annoying philosophical level, saying, well, even that doesn't get you to what it was like to be a bat with echolocation. You're still within.
They are kind of approaching just the problem that troubles Immanuel Kant, and they are not gotten even there yet.
But that way, Kettle, you will not even know what your experience is. That way, Freud is, you cannot escape Freud there. You cannot even know what your own experience is completely in that sense. That journey is always there. But the problem is that the other side is saying that there's a point beyond which you cannot theorize in some senses, and that's an issue. That is an issue which is seriously and the other but where they have a point is that does it mean that if we try and search for knowledge beyond a certain point, we become anthropocentric, or is there another way to frame that problem? Is there another way to frame that question, which is not simply? And I think one good way is what Zupančič does. Personally, I think she is on point there in the way she's trying to frame that problem. In some senses, I think that's the way forward to do that kind of
Well, on that point, one of my favorite articles by Žižek is the Lacan as a viewer of Alien, where you get this idea that what's going on is trying to view not from the perspective of the human, but from the perspective of the alien.
Yeah, and that's one way to.
Which is, I think, from the perspective of the cut and the symptom, because in this paper, for example, to tie it back to this paper of repression and Freud, is that he says that the neurotic subject sees his primal repression as alien. So I think that's a nice way of saying, okay, what we're trying to do here is move philosophy into the realm of the alien.
Sexuality is
the other
in some senses, Yeah. There is that alien dimension there. You're right. I think.
I would just want to say, if anyone else wants to say anything, to do it now, and otherwise we're going to wrap up because it's been 2.5 hours.
This alien has to do with uncanny, with strangeness, that feeling we talked about.
And that's why I love that you show up every week, Alexandra.
I'm a bat.
All right. So I'm going to just summarize for those viewing afterwards that we were covering Freud's paper on repression from 1915. I think in this paper, we get basically a continuation of the paper that we covered on instincts and their vicissitudes, where Freud is going into a little more detail on the defense mechanism of repression. He sort of states, I think, very clearly that repression is something that becomes necessary because the mind cannot take flight from itself. The ego cannot escape itself. Probably in the Lacanian sense, we would just say the subject cannot escape itself. And so basically has to deal with this paradoxical motion we've been talking about in the discussion so much, between a sort of a positive force of a primal motion, instinctual, the primal instinctual representation, Freud calls it, and also the counter motion, which is basically like an after pressure, where we're dealing with sort of the mental derivatives, Freud says, the representative derivatives of the primal repression, and all sorts of conflicts of mind occur because of this. Many of the psychoneuroses Freud attributes to repression, and in our discussion afterwards, we've had many discussions about the status of primal repression, whether it can be thought of as pre-linguistic or linguistic. Many other discussions about, is it possible to get rid of repression or is it not? Is repression located in the depths or the surface? So that was a lot of the conversation, and I found it, again, I mean, every conversation we have, I think, is enlightening, and I always say it's the new best one, but yeah, we'll say this is the best one. So thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you all in the next Return to Freud.
I hope you merry repression mass.
Yeah,
It's a combination of Christmas and repression, since they are connected.
Yes, everyone have a great repression mass, and thank you to Nico for that new word.
All right.